and I'm honored to introduce our speaker today, Professor James Druckman of the University of Rochester. Jamie is an expert researcher of political behavior and experimental research in social sciences and has published dozens of high-impact and highly cited publications. He's also an international leader in political science scholarship as an editor, a grant winner, and principal investigator of multiple prominent studies. Jamie's talk today will focus on his co-authored article in the journal Science that conducts a mega study of 25 treatments that aim to reduce anti-democratic attitudes.
And we asked, what are the most efficacious psychological strategies for reducing partisans' animosity? And what are the most efficacious psychological strategies for reducing American support for undemocratic candidates? And so we launched this project called the Strengthening Democracy Challenge, and that's what I'm going to subsequently talk about. And so it came in a variety of steps. The first step, and there was a lot of getting to this point, which was a couple-year process of kind of determining what exactly we wanted to study in terms of outcomes and how this process would work. But I'm going to black box all of those parts of it. So we started with an open call crowdsourcing, and so the solicitation for ideas from as many sources as possible. And so we wanted to get ideas for interventions specifically. And then we were going to test it in a mega study. And so a mega study is a massive experiment where you have many different treatments that are tested synchronously in a large sample. And the advantage of a mega study is that you're putting all these different interventions on the same outcomes, same time scale, same sample. And so you're able to really see how they compare to one another in terms of their effect on the outcomes that you're studying. So I'll show you some of the results now. And so this is the results on partisan animosity. So we're trying to reduce partisan animosity, and so lower scores is what we're aiming for. And you can see here are the 25 interventions. And what is really interesting about this is virtually 23 out of the 25 or 22 out of the 25 at least had a statistically significant effect. So they're ranging in the size of their effects, as you can see, but it seems like people are pretty good at identifying, at least in the short term. I'll talk about durability in a little bit. At least in the short term, how to reduce partisan animosity. There were a few kind of general approaches that seem most effective. And so there's the question of how do these two things relate to one another? How does animosity relate to reducing support for undemocratic candidates? And so what you see here is just a figure on the x-axis is the effect size of an intervention on partisan animosity, and on the y-axis is the effect size on support for undemocratic candidates. And you can see here that these are pretty tightly correlated. So an intervention that affected one seemed to affect another. And this is quite interesting because in other parts of our study, we looked at not only violence, but also support for anti-democratic norms. So rather than about voting, just norms in general. And those really did not go with these two outcomes. So there were very different dynamics there. So there's some interesting things going on.
My question is, in the many hundreds of treatments which were suggested initially during the initial phase, there were many which, of course, were not selected. Were there some who you thought should have been included? And further, was one of the included from the ones which were actually used, which you found to be you favored, essentially?
And so, yeah, I mean, kind of in the process of paring down those interventions, there were definitely, by the end, when you got to the kind of the last 35 or 40, as in any type of selection system, at least in my experience, it gets a little bit arbitrary. Like, why do you choose one versus the other? There were a subset of interventions that had been already in the literature and had been tested very thoroughly by prior scholars. So we were attentive to try to include some of those simply because they were good benchmarks. And so that was kind of one of the things. Then, beyond that, once we got down to that, we wanted some kind of heterogeneity, both in practitioner background, professional, kind of academic, kind of nature of the intervention. So we didn't want to have 25 misperception interventions. And so, some of those considerations came in as well. Your question also raises the question is that we do have these other 225 or so interventions that went untested. And so we had talked about at various times of doing an adaptive experimental design, which is where you can test a lot more at once and you kind of watch how it's doing. And if it's not doing well, you stop testing it and you move those respondents to another treatment arm. And so I don't think we're ever going to end up pursuing that, but it would be an interesting thing to pursue because there could be a hidden intervention in there that's particularly effective.